to our panel we go. Glenn Greenwald, author of 2 New York Times bestsellers. 1, How Would a Patriot Act? And 2, A Tragic Legacy. His most recent book is The Great American Hypocrites. Glenn has been asking some great questions that I think we in the media ought to be asking. You can see he joins us from Brazil on Skype. Also with us on set, Arianna Huffington, co-founder, editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post, and a long list of other grand accomplishments, also fresh back from Israel. So it's nice to see you. Glenn, I will begin with you, though. What can we do better in asking questions about the Iran conversation and their nuclear resources that we did not necessarily do with Iraq or Afghanistan?
Well, I think the principal obligation should be to demand that there's actual evidence before believing the claims that are being made about Iran. For example, the president began by saying that Iran is violating the rules which all nations are required to abide by, and that seems to be actually false. The only obligation that Iran has under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is to disclose any facilities at least 180 days before nuclear material is introduced, and they did that well in advance of 180 days. They did it at least a year and a half before that facility is operable. And at the same time, America's key ally in that region, Israel, refuses to belong to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, refuses to have its nuclear stockpile inspected by the IAEA. And so there are nations, beginning with Israel, that refuse to comply with these rules. And I just think that the level of hysteria being generated about what is a facility that is not in operation, has no nuclear material in it, can very well be designed strictly for civilian purposes, and that Iran itself disclosed to the IAEA requires a lot more media scrutiny and skepticism towards the claims that are issuing about Iran.
Arianna, as the editor of one of the most widely read news aggregators in the world right now, how do you balance your coverage so that you're representing the apparent threat and at the same time not inciting either fear or irrational responses, because all these types of conversations can inherently be so scary?
Well, it's very important to stress that actually the international community is more united at the moment than it was before the president's decision on the defense missile shield, which was very popular in Russia. And so Russia, of course, is a key partner here in having a policy towards Iran that is accepted by the whole international community. That's very different from what happened with Iraq. And the other thing that makes this a little different than what Glenn was saying is the fact that Iran is actually challenging the existential presence of Israel. And so it's not just meaning that, they don't believe that Israel has the right to exist. They don't accept the reality of the Holocaust. So you have a player here that is actually presenting a major threat to Israel, which immensely complicates the international response.
Yeah. Jim, are you still with me? Is Jim Miklaszewski still here? No. Glenn, Arianna makes a couple of key points, most notably that last one, which is Iran's failure to acknowledge the validity or existence of Israel and their explicit expression of a desire to bomb Israel.
All right. Well, responsible people judge things by actions and not by rhetoric. There is all kinds of rhetoric issuing from, for example, the United States. I mean, John McCain stood up in the middle of the presidential campaign and sung songs about bombing Iran. I think actions are what matters. And if you look at the reality at actions of the various countries, what you see is that the United States currently is occupying 2 nations on either side of the Iranians on their eastern and western border in Afghanistan and in Iraq, because those are countries that we invaded, bombed, and are now occupying. Over the last 5 years, the Israelis have invaded and bombed Lebanon, Syria, and slaughtered huge numbers of civilians in the Gaza Strip. By contrast, when is the last time that Iran has invaded any other country? You have to go back several centuries. Over the last several years, you've had constant threats issuing from the United States and Israel about attacking Iran militarily. And so if you want to look at who the threats are in that region and who the actual aggressors are, I think it's a very hard case to make that Iran is some sort of a unique threat because of some crazy rhetoric that its president engages in that it could never possibly carry out. And I think that's what needs to be the focal point, is what is the reality of these countries' capabilities and what their actions something.
In other words, a crackpot saying something is very different than somebody doing something. Ariana, quickly, and then I want to get to Jonathan.
Well, just very quickly, I think he's more than a crackpot. You know, Ahmadinejad and the whole regime is incredibly oppressive, incredibly irrational. There's no way that we can know what they're going to do next. But I think the steps that are being taken to have real inspections, to actually have facts as opposed to rhetoric, is a very legitimate way to proceed.
Jonathan, you have a question?
I had a question for the other guests, and that is
Glenn.
Glenn. So you're justifying Iran's actions in terms of possibly pursuing a nuclear program for whatever purposes, and also I find it a little ironic you're saying that it has never shown any kind of aggression, yet on Dylan's tabletop, as you were saying that, he was showing video of Iran shooting off those missiles just this past weekend. So how do those two match up? I don't understand.
Well, if testing missiles is the sign of an aggressive regime, then the United States and Israel ought to be brought before the UN and be charged with all sorts of crimes, because nobody tests missiles more frequently or more aggressively than those two countries. Testing missiles is something that virtually every nation with a military does. And what Iran is saying with the testing of those missiles is, if you're going to continuously threaten us and threaten military action, and you can pick up any American newspaper or listen to people like you on television suggesting that Iran is this evil force and for doing things that...
Well, hang on, Glenn. None of us on television have suggested Iran's an evil force, so I don't know who you're referring to.
That was just the question that was asked. But the premise was, how can you possibly defend Iran for doing things that the United States and virtually every other power does?
Understood, but I don't think that Jonathan said they were an evil force.
Stockpiles of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, no, I understand. Your points are valid. I just don't want you to be suggesting things are being said here that weren't said. Glenn, great to have the conversation. Jonathan, stick around. Ariana, you're going to join us for the hour. Thank you for that.